And here we have another trust essay from a past bar exam. If you were on the bar, the first thing you would look at is the calls of the question to figure out what the subject is. We have two calls here. First call, what interests, if any, do Dot, Sam, and or Bob have in the house and the ranch? That doesn't tell me that this is trust. It could be property, could be trusts, could be wills. I don't know strictly from that call. Call 2, though, tells me that this is trust, because call 2 says, what duties, if any, has Sam violated as trustee of the testamentary trust, and what remedies, if any, does Bob have against him? The other thing that tells me this is not wills is that this is a past California hypothetical. And in California, wills is tested under the California probate code. So if there were wills here, we would see an instruction following one or both of those calls that said answer according to California law. We don't see that. So this is probably a pure trusts essay. Second call is about trustee duties, fiduciary duties. First call basically asks what instrument is in place and who gets the house and the ranch. All right, in the hypothetical we see Wendy, a widow, owned a house in the city and a ranch in the country. She created a valid Inter-vivos trust, naming herself and her daughter Dot as co-trustees, and providing that she had the power to revoke or amend the trust at any time in writing by a document signed by her and delivered to her and Dot as co-trustees. This paragraph goes to formation. I know it says a valid Inter-vivos trust, but I'm going to form this trust in my answer anyway. I'm going to establish that she met the trust elements. She's the grantor. I will discuss intent, purpose, raise, trustee, and ascertainable beneficiaries. The intent has to be the intent to divide legal and equitable title. It's not just the intent to create a testamentary instrument. It's the intent to create a trust, which means divide legal and equitable title. She has demonstrated that intent by granting legal title to herself and Dot as co-trustees. They manage the property, the raise in the trust, and equitable title to her sister and then to Dot. And another good thing to put in my answer when I'm forming this trust is that ordinarily a trust is presumed irrevocable, but here Wendy has reserved the right to amend or revoke. Under express conditions, she's reserved that right to herself. As I read this hypothetical, though, I'm beginning to understand that there must be another instrument in the hypothetical, because the call asked me about the house and the ranch, and this trust deals solely with the ranch. It sets up an income beneficiary and a remainderman for that particular piece of property, but we have not yet seen an instrument that devises or somehow deals with the house. So I've got to keep track of this. Sis is the income beneficiary and Dot gets the remainder. When I'm thinking about trustee duties, I'm also thinking about the duty to allocate fairly, to allocate between the income and the principal, which has to be preserved for the remainder beneficiary. So that is always in my mind when I'm dealing with trusts, particularly when I'm asked about violation of trustee duties. Now paragraph 2. Years later, Wendy prepared a valid will in which she stated, I hereby revoke the trust I previously established and leave my house and my ranch to my son, Sam, as trustee, to be held in trust for the benefit of my brother Bob. 5 years after my death, the trust shall terminate, and all assets then remaining in the trust shall be distributed outright to Sam. So this is a second trust being created here. This one is a testamentary trust. And what Wendy tried to do was to revoke the first trust, the private express Inter-vivos trust, and put into this testamentary trust as raise both the house and the ranch. She's named Sam as trustee and as remainderman, which sets up a conflict of interest for Sam. And I'm thinking about that because Sam is in call 2. That conflict exists because Sam is both trustee and remainderman in this second trust. But he has a duty to allocate fairly. Income is to go to brother Bob for 5 years. So what is the raise of this trust? And does it validly revoke the first trust, the Inter-vivos trust? Well, my analysis would be that it does not, because in that first trust, she specified what had to be done to revoke the trust. She had the power, but to do it, she had to put it in writing, sign the document, and deliver it to herself and to Dot as co-trustees. So although she tried to name Bob as the income beneficiary and Sam as the remainderman over both the house and the ranch, this instrument alone would not do that, because the next sentence says Wendy died. Following her death, both Dot and Sam were surprised to find her will. That tells us that she did not fulfill the conditions of revocation in that Inter-vivos trust. She did not deliver that signed writing, that will, to Dot. So I would say that revocation failed. Dot now has refused to serve as trustee under the Inter-vivos trust, and she claims that as a result the trust fails and that the ranch should immediately be given to her. That is not going to happen, because no trust fails for lack of a trustee. The probate court will simply appoint one. So that argument will not work. But that's part of my analysis of call 1. What interests, if any, do Dot, Sam, and or Bob have in the house and the ranch? That Inter-vivos private express trust is still in operation, and that governs who has the ranch. Sam has agreed to serve as trustee under the testamentary trust and claims that the ranch is part of the trust. I don't think so. Sam then sells the house at fair market price to himself in his individual capacity and invests all the assets of the trust into his new business, Sam's Solar. Bob objects to sale of the house and to Sam's investment. Bob is the income beneficiary of that second trust, the testamentary trust. So this paragraph goes to call 2. The duties Sam has violated as trustee of that testamentary trust. He's violated the duty of loyalty and the duty of due care. So by going through this systematically and thinking about what the status is at each point in this hypothetical, I think I have everything I need to write my answer now, including this last paragraph where we see breaches of the duty of loyalty and due care. So with all the analysis we've already talked about, on call 1, I'm going to come to the bottom line conclusion that the ranch is still held in the first trust because it was not validly revoked. A new trustee is going to be appointed. It'll be held in trust for the benefit of Dot for her life, and on Sis's death, Dot will receive the remaining assets of the ranch. As to the house should be held in trust for Bob, and in 5 years the house will go to Sam. But we have in that last paragraph that Sam has sold that house at fair market price. This goes to call 2, trustee duties. He has to safeguard the trust assets. He has to hold them for the benefit of the beneficiaries. And he owes loyalty and due care to them. He has to act along the lines of a reasonably prudent person when he's making decisions about that trust raise. So start with the duty of loyalty. The trustee has to act in the best interests of the trust and not in his own self-interest. But what Sam did here was self-dealing. He interacted with those trust assets for his own self-benefit. That's a per se breach of the duty of loyalty. Once we prove self-dealing, then it doesn't matter that it was beneficial for the trust or that he sold the house at fair market price. And what makes this even worse is that he invested all the assets from selling the house into his own new business. That's another instance of per se self-dealing. So there's no question he breached the duty of loyalty. What about due care? He has to act as a reasonably prudent person would. But Sam didn't do that here. He sold the entire raise of the trust to himself. So what kind of interest is he going to be able to provide for 5 years to Bob? Even if he thought the ranch was part of the raise of the trust, he had to know that that was in dispute, and he should have waited for that to be resolved. And what about the duty to allocate fairly, to protect the interests of both the life income or the income beneficiary and the remainderman? He ignored that here. He sold the entire raise to himself, leaving no income for the income beneficiary. That was a breach of the duty of impartiality here. So what kind of remedies do we have for Bob? Well, Bob has standing because he was an income beneficiary. So he can ask for a constructive trust on the person holding the trust property if they improperly received it. And if there's an inadequate legal remedy and the person currently holding the property would be unjustly enriched. And I think that you can find all of that here against Sam. So the court can impose a constructive trust on the house for Bob's benefit. That would mean that Sam actually holds that house in trust for the benefit of Bob for the next 5 years. What about tracing the assets? Because there was self-dealing here. Bob can seek to retrieve the funds through tracing for the benefit of the trust. And finally, because Sam breached duties as trustee, Bob can ask the court to remove him as trustee and appoint a new trustee. Those are the remedies I would raise for Bob. Trust hypotheticals are really quite doable as long as you know the basic law, and there isn't that much of the basic law. It's not a huge subject like constitutional law or all of property law. Simply take a point in time look at that hypothetical. At each point as things happen, decide who has interests in what and how do those interests change with the next event. And by the time you reach the end of the hypothetical, you'll have the answers to all of the calls.